And now, I'd like to introduce our presenter. Michael VIOLETTE is a professional engineer and is founder and CEO of Washington Laboratories. He has worked in compliance since 600 megahertz seemed like high frequency and has authored numerous articles and publications for and about the industry. He has expanded WLL's operation to Asia and co-founded American Certification Body with operations in the US, EU, and Asia, providing certification services to the global market. So, without further ado, let's turn our attention to wireless modular certification for Europe, IoT, and other applications with Mike VIOLETTE. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Hi, Kim. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Good. Well, I want to thank you for that introduction and running this webinar for us. And I want to thank the folks who are tuning live from various places in the U.S. and perhaps Europe and other parts of the globe. And I hope everybody's staying well during these times. So this discussion will talk specifically about modular approvals in the European Union. Radio products into the EU have to comply with something called the Radio Equipment Directive, or sometimes known as RED or RE Directive. It's not the RED Directive, that's a little bit redundant. So this directive was initially launched in 2014 and came into force a couple of years ago and superseded and replaced the older Radio and Terminal Equipment Directive, or the RNTTE Directive. A few definitions first. First, what is a notified body? A notified body is an independent body that can assess the technical compliance of a device. It may be a radio, it could be a non-radio product, it could be a medical product, but the notified body has specific authority to issue certificates. And the way this is performed is by reviewing what's called the technical documentation. And the technical documentation may include all manner of information from test reports to schematics to design details. And it's the role of the notified body to make sure that the device complies with all the requirements of whatever directive they're issuing their certificate. I note that notified bodies are businesses, not government agencies, and are not government funded. We are notified bodies, and we operate on a fee-based schedule depending on the type of product and the scope of the examination. Another definition that you'll see is the REDCA, or the Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association. And it's a membership group primarily for notified bodies to exchange information, to develop ways of assessment, to share common issues across the industry. And it's publicly available. Some of the documents, if you're not a member, you can download some, but some documents are restricted to memberships. But the REDCA publishes technical guidance notes, and there's several dozen of these things, depending on the type of information that is trying to be teased out. And you can look at several of these at the REDCA website. Ultimately, though, for whatever device is getting on the market, typically the compliance with the RED requires a Declaration of Conformity, or a DOC. And this DOC is issued by the manufacturer to declare compliance with the Radio Equipment Directive. So this is solely a manufacturer document, and the manufacturer takes complete responsibility of the information that's conveyed by the DOC. Now, this may be a manufacturer, but might be someone else is putting it on the market. For perhaps maybe a European seller or distributor wants a certain product that's coming from outside of Europe on the market, and then they would issue the Declaration of Conformity. So the RED scope applies to radio equipment used for communications or radio determination, or radar type of applications. So these are any kind of transmitter, receiver, transceivers, and regardless of the function of what would be called the host device. So for example, you may have a PC or a laptop with a radio module in there, and obviously quite common. So that laptop itself is considered a radio device. The RNTTE directive used to apply to wired telecommunications equipment, but now if devices such as fax machines or modems, if they don't have a radio, they don't fall under the RED scope. The frequency range is quite broad, up to 3,000 gigahertz or 3 terahertz, and it includes all the way down below 9 kilohertz. So those would be extremely unique applications. Now, it's noted that a lot of standards are still being developed for the very low and the very high frequency ranges. As the technology tends to move, the standards tend to try to keep up with those technologies. So the RED assessment covers 3 items: product safety, which is essentially equivalent to evaluation under the low voltage directive, EMC performance, and radio performance or spectrum use. Now, many other directives may apply to the devices as well, such as medical device directive, machinery directive, the restriction of hazardous substance directives. Those directives may apply in addition to the RED. So your declaration of conformity may have declarations to several directives. However, if the RED applies to anything with a radio in it, so now the EMC directive and local directive do not apply if the RED applies, which means you do not issue a declaration to either of those other 2 directives because it's embedded in the RED. Now, I want to note that the EU frequency bands, there's a lot of harmonization, but it's not completely harmonized. There are countries that have their own specific allocations. So you can look at the general allocations in this ERC Report 25, which has the allocation tables. And there's a very handy website, the EFIS, European Frequency Information System, which I've used quite a few times when clients come to me and say, hey, I've got this device that's operating in a band in the States. Can I sell it to Europe? And so this particular tool is pretty handy for determining either European-wide harmonization or country-by-country harmonizations. And that includes not just unlicensed devices, but licensed devices. Now, it's simply a harmonization table. It does not have limitations. You need to take it up to go that far to determine how to evaluate your equipment. Another good guidance is this REC 70-03, and it's for mostly for short-range devices, which means low-power devices. So how about modules? There is no such thing as a modular approval in the European Union. There's no certification in the EU for RED. A notified body may issue a type examination certificate, but it's not a pure certification process. But it's based on the declaration of conformity of the final radio equipment placed on the market. So the RED supersedes a lot of the other requirements, except for the ones I noted before. So how does this impact the Internet of Things? Of course, this is all in the popular press and in technical press, and so the IoT is a initiative or a technology force that includes things like machine-to-machine communications, vehicle-to-X. It may embed elements of what's happening in the 5G world, cloud and fog computing, and EMC is throughout all of these types of technologies. I'll just point out one note is the IEEE, I'm a lifelong member, has the IoT initiative. And the IoT is defined as a network of items, each embedded with sensors, which are connected to the internet. So this is one particular thing that we're doing, project we're doing is for insulin delivery system. And the device that's on the body communicates with some kind of, could communicate with a phone, which could be connected to the internet. So that's an example of a medical device that has a radio product in it as well. So there's a lot of wearable technologies, of course, smartwatches and so forth, and these may use Bluetooth or Bluetooth low energy types of protocols. We've done a project for a major manufacturer who puts a Bluetooth device inside the drill. And the drill, so the drill has connections, sensors such as sensing battery, life, heat, vibration, impact perhaps, and the Bluetooth device can communicate back to a smartphone or something like that. That can have that information conveyed back to the drill manufacturer in some way. See the Internet of Bicycles. First noticed this phenomenon about 6 or 7 years ago, where there's tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of bicycles that have been deployed all over China and Taiwan. So this is pretty common, pretty much everywhere, anywhere. But first noticed this profusion a few years ago. And these bicycles have a little Bluetooth communication pod in there, and it talks to the cell phone of the user that can send a command to unlock the bike. So we really have bicycles, lots of millions of bicycles on the internet now. Another area that's been curiously development is IoT in the mill environment. We're talking about more wireless fighters, is the term that's been coined, including body-worn applications, land, air, sea assets, over-the-horizon comms. Very interesting development of technology in the tactical environment. And one particular device, I'm just pointing this out as an example, is the attack protocols, which is an Android-based geospatial infrastructure that allows warfighters to communicate with each other under various environments. So this development of IoT is really driving modular, the popularity of modular devices, because these are by the IoT device development. So let's go back to Europe. Again, radio modules in the European Union, they are just radio equipment. There's no special modular certification designation under the EU Radio Equipment Directive. For example, in the United States and Canada, FCC and ISED has specific radio module types of requirements. If you want to sell a radio module, you have to have certain requirements of shielding and voltage regulation, etc. However, there is no specific requirements for radio modules in the EU. The manufacturer is expected to assess the module for its intended environment. So that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And not all CE marks are equal. But in the end, the manufacturer must have very explicit installation instructions for the end host integrator. And the module must be fully assessed as radio equipment, including the safety, EMC, and radio, including the CE marking requirements, the declaration of conformity, a risk assessment, which could be kind of tricky if you're not sure what your end product, the end host environment or application might be. That's why it's very specifically required to have instructions for the integrator to properly implement the radio module or the radio device. So radio performance tests should be easy. Typically the module will have a connector of some kind or an integrated antenna, so it's relatively straightforward to make those measurements. However, EMC might be a little more tricky because you don't know what the end packaging or configuration might be. So you have to make an educated technical judgment on what kind of EMC test would be appropriate. Safety is important, but maybe minimal, because typically these things are low voltage type of module operations. So the electrical hazards aren't too severe. However, you do have to consider the RF assessment and give specific guidance in the integration instructions on how to place antennas and warnings about keep out zones and so forth. So another kind of module, if you have a CE mark radio module, if the device is plugged into a host and can be removed by a user, like a USB dongle or something, then a separate equipment assessment is separate from the assessment of the host. And saying that again is that the module itself has a standalone CE marking if it has this kind of application that could be plugged in and out of a host. So if then the radio module's CE marking kind of goes away because the end product has to be assessed in its entirety. And the manufacturer is basically putting on a new product on the market. And again, because they're creating basically a new product, they have to do a full assessment to all the requirements of the RED. And then the final product will be CE marked, and the CE mark of the module no longer exists. However, there are some differences or some special exemptions, such as if the host is a vehicle or fixed installation, the radio module assessment remains separate from the assessment of the host. So, you know, vehicles, cars, anything that moves has its own regimen for approval in the European Union. So in these types of applications, the radio module still maintains its approval. That's because type approval of these vehicles is a little different than maybe some equipment you might use in your house or in the office. So the installer of the radio module has to make sure that it lists the standards of other assessment modules on their DOC. So this may include the ETSI standards that you may have used. It could include the EMC standards that were used, the safety standards that were used. Well, what is the benefit of a CE marked radio module? Well, it's not like the FCC where there's particular rules on radio module certification. And you may not have a module that has the 8 qualities of a FCC or ISED listing, such as voltage regulator, buffer, shields, and so forth. And the install contains a radio parameters, the transmitter and receiver. So that is why the end product has to be assessed in its entirety. Again, back to the installer's technical documentation. To have what's called a presumption of conformity, the installer must have the test results that show compliance of the product with the harmonized test standards, if they exist. If they don't have all these tests, they do not have the presumption of conformity. And the module test results do not always relate to end product compliance. And this becomes kind of a tricky thing in our world when we're trying to guide people on how to assess a host product where they've integrated a third-party radio module. And it really requires understanding how the device is going to be used. The manufacturer should have a good understanding of the end use and what the typical applications may be in order to make a proper assessment of those end tests. So we may choose not to perform a lot of the radio tests if we have sufficient documentation from the radio module manufacturer that the device complies with the necessary requirements. And this is where there's you take a little bit of a risk, perhaps, or educated technical guess, because the end installer may not. Excuse me. The end installer may not have control over all the radio parameters. Anyway, so this is put out under the final risk assessment of the final radio product. However, at the end, the manufacturer of the final radio product is signing the final DOC and taking all the responsibility. So it really takes a little bit of study, a little bit of understanding to make sure that the assessment is done fully and correctly. Technical documentation. The final radio product, as any product, has to be assessed to the latest requirements for compliance to the RED. And this is interesting or important because standards change, and there's no grandfathering under the Radio Equipment Directive if a standard changes. So the end integrator must understand the information coming from the module manufacturer meets the latest requirements. And if the things have changed, then some additional assessment may be necessary. So the technical documentation includes everything, or at least there should be an ability to access it. This would be used by market surveillance folks, for example. The DOC, however, must be applicable for the final product in all of the standards and directives that apply to it. So what happens in the area if there's a market surveillance issue? Well, if there's a non-compliant radio module and only the module, and the market surveillance would go to the module manufacturer. However, if there's a non-compliant final radio product with an integrated module, then the end manufacturer would be the one that the market surveillance folks would go to. So we talked about TGN. These are technical guidance notes. And again, these are issued or generated by the Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association, which we mentioned earlier. So a TGN is a guidance note. It's guidance. It does not change the requirements of the directives. And it can't change what's called the red guide or the blue guide. These guidance documents are developed by notified bodies to help guide the notified bodies in their assessments. So they're really created for cases where the existing documentation is not clear or there are questions that have arisen in industry. But they do not change or override any of the directive requirements. So this is the status is agreed to and published by the REDCA. It sometimes requires a vote. The EU Commission and what's called the Administrative Council, or RED, do not formally endorse or publish these TGNs, but they're members of the association, and so they do engage in the writing process and the comment periods. And they're open to having inputs on the TGNs. So again, what's the use of this document? There's nothing in the RED to explain a TGN. It's not embedded in there. So this is a process that was developed after the RED was published in order to provide this type of clarifications of what the industry expects to see during the assessment. Again, why does the REDCA create a TGN? I've basically said that it's used as a guidance note. And they have the REDCA has typically in the past met twice a year where they come up with these TGNs and discuss them in great detail. And there's a formal online sort of process to respond to comments and to provide suggestions on improving the TGNs. So there's another document called a ref doc, and it's just simple for a reference document. And it's a copy of all the discussions that the REDCA had. It's not formally endorsed. It's basically minutes of the meetings. So let's talk about TGN 01. So modules are so critical in device development now that the first technical guidance note, number 1, covers modules. As we know, the RED applies to radio equipment, and some radio equipment is intended to be used inside other products. So the TGN 01 deals with that industry. Now, there's nothing in the RED that talks about radio modules particularly. However, because it's such a colloquially understood term, the term radio module isn't used in TGN 01. And this particular one, because of its importance, is free for download from the REDCA website, even if you're not a member. And I think membership is something like 600 euros a year. So TGN 01 only deals with radio equipment in the scope of the RED. Now, if a manufacturer has a chip which is not radio equipment, perhaps it's some kind of component, it's not within the scope of TGN 01. It doesn't attempt to redefine radio equipment because it's in the RED. So what devices are any radio equipment that is installed in a host device? It's regardless of the size or the method of installation. A small solder down radio module for use only when installed on a circuit board is in the TGN 01. So a finished product like a wireless LAN or access point and permanently installed in some other product at the time the new product is manufactured is also in TGN 1. So there's a couple of classifications. There's a summary of the types of radio modules include connections to or into a host, such as a USB dongle I mentioned before. Connected into a host, everything is contained in the module. And for connection to the host, it becomes part of the host and the antenna is on the host. So that drives requirements for the installation to exactly detail how you might convey the radio frequency energy out to the antenna that's installed on the host. So TGN01, this is a little summary page. Radio equipment per RED for notified bodies in the REDCA. This includes, of course, test lab and manufacturer members of the REDCA. So this is additional definitions. Radio module, that's the thing that's being installed. The host is the final system, whatever that might be. And the final radio product is a combination of the module and the host together. And this can include any radio equipment. So again, if the radio module is radio equipment within the scope of the RED, it must be fully assessed to Articles 3.1 for safety, 3.1b for EMC, 3.2 for radio, and 3.3 if applicable. So the module manufacturer cannot leave it all for the installer to take care of it. That's because the module, the installer or the host developer may not have command of the software that is necessary to assess the radio performance of the module. And we find this happens to us quite often, where a host manufacturer will integrate something into their product, but they don't have the deep level code access to determine radio frequency power or the frequencies themselves or modulation types. And these are all things that we need to assess under the 3.2 of the RED for the radio spectrum requirements. So for this, requirements for radio module manufacturers, it's quite a short section, and the RED applies to all radio equipment directive. We shouldn't need a TGN on that. Again, the TGN makes it clear that the module manufacturer has to give detailed information to the installer if it is a module to be installed. So some of the list of more important items to consider. It's necessary for installers to understand the case where the module is used not as assessed, and therefore when a reassessment is needed. So what does that mean? Maybe there's a unique application that the module manufacturer had not intended the radio device to perform. That might be certain frequencies or some other applications. I can't think of an exact example right now, but you have to, again, the installer has to understand what the module manufacturer intended when they developed the product. So under the long-standing CE marking regimen, we say CE plus CE does not equal CE. What does that mean? Well, you might have a CE marked radio module and you're putting it into an existing CE marked product. That happens quite often, but you cannot simply do nothing. You have to do some kind of assessment for the articles under the radio equipment directive. So you might compare that installation to a module assessment, and anything new or different requires reassessment. It may or may not mean more testing. Again, it depends on the case. So in the summary of the three critical articles are Article 3.1a, safety. Again, this might be electrical safety. It certainly includes some kind of RF safety evaluation for maximal permissible exposure, or perhaps even SAR requirements if you're using something close to the body and the power is above a certain level. Article 3.1b is for EMC. This is pretty much a new assessment on a final product, most cases. So when you integrate a module into existing device, again, you have to do something to assess the EMC of the device. But as pointed out here, the immunity on a radio module does not relate to EMC on the final product because the construction will certainly be different. And then finally, Article 3.2, radio spectrum use. The installer, again, may use to trust or use some of the previous message conducted from the antenna port. And this is especially true if the antenna is external and they have a connector on it. And this happens quite often in in our case, where we say, look, this radio module is CE marked. What standards were used? Is there any way to get test results, or at least a declaration of conformity from the module manufacturer stating compliance with the radio requirements? But in the end, anything that is affected by the enclosure should be checked. For example, radiated emissions, perhaps EIRP measurements checked, spurious emissions, maybe, if you're suspicious of the data from the module manufacturer, you need to cross-check it. So the responsibility of the installer, any acceptance of the test data is at the discretion of the installer or the final radio manufacturer. So justifications for using that data should be included in the risk assessment of the final radio product. And again, in the end, the manufacturer of the final device is signing the declaration and taking all the responsibility. So in the end, the DOC must be applicable to the final product and reference all the standards that were used to assess and issue CE marking. Now, accessories like antenna and software version may be relevant and therefore listed on the DOC. And we're finding more and more people are paying attention to the software versions because things evolve very quickly. And one of the critical parts of that is to make sure that the software versions don't allow unintentional or illegal operation. So this is something that you should document, and the module manufacturer should document, and the end installer should at least have access to that information, if possible. So we mentioned notified bodies and briefly a type examination certificate, or TEC. The TEC of a radio module is not transferable as the EU of a final product. This might be because not all standards were assessed, not all harmonized standards existed for the device, and the notified body may have taken some judgments as to what they issued when they issued the type examination certificate, if that's necessary. So basically, if there's no harmonized standard for a product, and this is a general statement for the Radio Equipment Directive, then a notified body type exam must be sought and issued before the DOC can be valid. And when we do these reviews, we like to see as much technical documentation as possible from the radio module when it's part of the assessment. Now, we might be able to accept another type exam certificate from another notified body. We may choose to do that, or we may choose just to accept a declaration of conformity from the module manufacturer. It would be important that any test results from the radio module used for the final radio product to be in the technical documentations, and its use justified in the risk assessment. I mentioned this already. So the notified body has to show that they've reviewed all the necessary technical documents. So there's a couple example cases in TGN 01 Annex A. So there's assessment examples for the final radio product. For example, various RF exposure test cases, and that depends on the output power and the distance from the user of the equipment. So these are general requirements, and some exceptions may depend on the construction of the final device, but typically if there's less than 20 milliwatts, you may not require any further assessment. If you're more than 20 milliwatts and greater than 20 centimeters, may only require a simple MPE calculation, too complicated. However, if you're at a higher power and you're close to the body, this could be the head or your hands or your body itself, may require a SAR test. So one of the assessments issues for a final radio product, again, depends on the various radio test cases. And this can be viewed as whether it has an internal or external antenna, because the host product construction could provide shielding of the module if there's an internal antenna, or it could affect spurious emissions and field strengths from spurious emissions, because you may have some shielding that could reflect and focus energy at some frequency. That's possible. And in the end, if you got a radio module with a trace design to an antenna on the host, will require additional testing because you changed the radio structure, the transmitting structure. So for some final radio products under TGN Annex A, and the details are there, is that spot check testing only may be possible. Installer may base decisions on the test data of the module. So it's nice to have that if it's available. And this includes their decisions as part of the risk assessment. As the risk assessment in this sense could include any part of the radio equipment directive, may include risk to the spectrum use. It could be a risk to EMC, etc. And there's some references to existing documentation and some guidance on that under these standards. So some examples of notes for the notified body to add to their type exam, depends on the use. But for example, we may note on the TEC that it's a professional installation only. The details of the host environment need to be assessed. You might have different cable lengths and types that have been used in the product evaluation. There may be conditions on the environment, such as input voltage and power, temperatures, outdoor, indoor use, etc. And also notes on what the RF exposure safe distances might be. And certainly instruction that the installer is fully responsible for compliance of the final radio product. So there's some notes in Annex B for the notified body to add to their type examination. For example, some example text which the notified bodies are encouraged to include on the type examination certificates that they use. And these types of examples have come out under discussion under REDCA, the notified bodies having specific use cases that I think that these example texts may be useful for the type examination certificate to include. So that's it. I'm going to wrap it up right here. We've got some time for any questions that anybody might have. Kim?
All right, thank you, Mike. I do see a question that came in, and it's, if there is no requirements for modular approval, then how can we determine if radio module qualifies for modular approval or not for EU?
Well, there are requirements because the radio module is simply radio equipment under the RED. So depending on the device and its use, you would go, a module manufacturer would go and get whatever harmonized standards apply to their frequency and to their intended use. So again, the radio module is radio equipment under the RED. It just transforms a little bit. If you take a module with a CE mark and install it in a final host product, then the radio module CE marking gets lost, as we said. And then the final CE marking depends on the entire system, assessed as a system.
Okay, next question. What kind of an assessment is done when multiple radios are co-transmitting in the final radio product?
Well, there would be assessments, certainly first RF power, RF human exposure. And so the evaluation has to take into account, the use, the spacings between the antennas, perhaps. If there's concerns about intermodulation products that might be generated by transmitters that are located very close to each other, that would be another assessment. It's more of an EMC assessment than a safety assessment. But you have to look at everything. You need to look at the RF spectrum use and the EMC if they're close, and the safety assessment if the transmitters are located close to a human body. And that's typically noted before less than 20 centimeters. So you have to do a little bit of calculation, EIRP, and potential combinations of the devices operating. For example, if they don't operate simultaneously, perhaps the assessment can be a little bit limited. However, if the transmitters operate simultaneously, you certainly have to consider RF power and EMC issues.
Okay, next question. Are module manufacturers expected to provide lists of tests to be performed at host level?
That would be really nice. I'll be honest with you. It's a challenge for us to get much information from module manufacturers for various reasons. I don't know. Some module manufacturers are better than others at providing that information. The stuff that we'd like to see at least would be the DOCs, and in rare cases we may get a look at some test results. But I think what that leads to is perhaps if you can have a good discussion with the module manufacturer and discuss the intended installation, there may be some good ideas that come out of what system level assessment might be appropriate.
Okay, next question. Please explain more on radio control via software, all in module, all in host, or mixed?
I'd say it typically could be all of the above. It's certainly probably not all in the host, because there's always a base level of code in the radio module that does the final controls. So this again is an interface issue between the host and the module manufacturer. And the module manufacturer may provide little to lots of guidance on that. We found one of the challenges about doing an end product assessment is to get the radios to operate in a defined way so we can make our measurements if we're taking measurements. And so that is usually, again, lower level code that may or may not be accessible to the final host manufacturer's platform level software, if I can say it that way.
Okay, next question. Go ahead.
Yeah, in any event, the final platform level software, whatever that might be, should not and can't, do something to the radio module software core that causes a non-compliant situation. That's to be avoided. Okay.
If module manufacturer selling radio modules to specific supplier on business cases, is it mandatory to comply EMC and safety requirements for the radio module?
Well, if you're developing a device that will only be used in a specific installation, I would say that you would not have to do CE marking on the module. In the end, it's whoever's placing the product on the market, they're responsible for the CE marking. So if you're selling a radio module to a specific integrator, and that is all you're doing, then I'd say you could probably avoid having to do CE marking on the module because you're not placing it on the market. You're basically providing a radio performance circuit or circuitry for the end integrator to use in their case. In the end, the end integrator would be responsible in any case for the CE marking.
Okay. Does EU need the contains label on the host similar to that of the FCC?
No. No, the module disappears, essentially, and the final compliance is at the host level, which would include the integrated module.
All right. Looks like the last question as of now. What are the measurement procedures for simultaneously transmissions and how to calculate the MPE as per CE requirements.
Well, in general, the procedures would be appropriate for the type of equipment that you're measuring, and you use the standards for the appropriate radio equipment. Now, what's curious about that, and it's a very good question, is that you may have several different modules, theoretically, that all operate at different frequencies, and obviously, and all have to comply with different ETSI standards. So in this case, you need to know something about what the existing compliance are, and you may apply at the system level a combination of ETSI standards to make that assessment.
All right, really, we had another question come in. You have time?
Sure.
If module has EU, gotta bear with me here, it has EU TEC and RF test standards are not harmonized, does the host must have its own EU TEC, or can it rely on module EU TEC?
I would say it would need its own TEC. Now, you could reference some existing test data or something, some assessments, but you probably need your own type examination certificate because it applies to the end product.
All right, I think that's it. That's all the questions. Thank you for that, Mike, for answering them. If you think of any questions after this webinar, as you see in front of you, there's email addresses that you can email your question to. You can still also email to questions@wll.com, and I still will make sure that Mike receives those questions. Our thanks goes out to Michael VIOLETTE for taking time out to enlighten us about wireless modular certification for Europe, IoT, and other applications. We have a few more webinars lined up to complete our 2020 webinar series. We are currently working on finalizing dates and times with the presenters. If you haven't already done so, make sure you visit our website to subscribe to our Washington Labs Academy to receive updates. This is easily done by visiting WLL.com. You want to click on that training tab in the upper right-hand corner, and then go ahead and fill in your information where you see sign up for updates. On behalf of the Washington Labs Academy, I would like to thank you all for attending. I will now end this event. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and most importantly, please be safe. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kimberly.
All right, you're welcome.